In this video, we're going to make some configuration changes to Android Studio and also install a few extra options that are useful. So start by launching Android Studio and then click on the configure menu at the bottom of the screen down here, as you can see me doing now. So next we have to launch something called the SDK Manager. So I'm going to select that, and this is where you manage the various components of Android Studio and make some changes which we're about to do. Now when it starts, you may have seen a status at the bottom of the window briefly while it checked for updates. Now this window is actually resizable even though the icons don't show on Windows, so you can resize it instead of looking at the various packages in a small list box. I've already done that, as you can see. Okay, so at the top of the window you can see the path to your SDK, Android SDK location. That's the SDK stands for Software Development Kit. The SDK is all the classes that make up Android, as well as things like the emulator and a few other tools. One problem you can get is if you've installed your SDK in a location that contains spaces in its path. This can happen on Windows in particular. Windows allows spaces in usernames, so your home directory could end up being something like c:\users\tim space Bachauka. It's not a good idea to use spaces in the names of objects, including directories and usernames. However, Windows does allow it. If there is a space somewhere in your SDK path, you won't be able to make any changes on the screen. Everything might be disabled. Now this doesn't just affect Android Studio, you'll also get problems with other programs if your home directory contains a space. So to proceed in that scenario, you'll need to move your SDK folder to a different location so that there's no spaces in its name. Now obviously you can see in my case I haven't got any spaces, so I'm good to go. But if you have got spaces, use your operating system's file manager program to copy the SDK directory to another location. On Windows, and keep in mind this generally only happens on Windows, you could copy the Android directory to /users/public, for example. You'll have full permissions to public and there'll be no problems moving it there. But you can also put it anywhere that you have permission to write to, just make sure there's no spaces in the path. Alright, so this is the Android SDK Manager, and from here what we can do is install some additional features. And we can also update some components if in fact updates are available. So on the SDK Platforms tab, you can see that all versions of Android that have been released there going way back to 2.1 at the bottom of the screen. So come over here and click on the Show Package Details option, that checkbox. We can expand those Android versions, and you can see there's quite a lot that you can add to each one. There's really no need to install most of the previous Androids, and I certainly don't suggest you try to install all of them. The latest Android SDK platform also allows you to create apps that run on earlier versions, so you don't need the other versions to create your apps. The other thing to be aware of is that your SDK directory can get very big if you install a lot of options. 40 gigabytes is very easy to get to, and that's really without everything installed. So if you're a bit mad here, you could end up using an awful lot of disk space. However, if you want to preview layouts in earlier Android versions, then you will need to install the Android SDK platform for that version. Now that probably won't make much sense at the moment, but we'll do that later in the course if needed. You can come back in here later though and install more things when you've decided that you need them. So there are quite a few options here, but it looks far worse than it is. The various components are pretty much the same for every Android version, so we can concentrate on the latest version at the top, Android 10.0 Q. Now if you see something there that says preview, then you're going to want to ignore that. Don't install anything marked preview. Now in this case, because Android Q was released shortly before I recorded this video, it's the latest released version and we're not seeing a preview version. So anytime we see a preview version, I suggest you ignore it. By the way, a preview means it's not ready for release. It's basically there for testing for experienced developers and not recommended when you're learning to program a specific technology. But if you see a later version than this after you're watching this video that's not a preview, then also feel free to install that as well. But as of the time I'm recording this video, Android 10.0 API 29 is the latest version, as you can see. Alright, so a good guide is to make sure the sources for Android options available. And you can see that's checked on my installation. If the sources aren't available, and you can see that they are now for Android 10, then install the most recent version that does have the sources. We're going to install the Android API 29. That may already be installed, and in fact it is, you can see in my case, but it may or may not be on your computer, so check it if it isn't. So specifically what we want to do is install Android SDK Platform 29, which is checked, sources for Android 29, which is checked, but we also want to install this Intel x86 Atom system image. We want to also come down here and select the Google APIs Intel x86 Atom system image, which was already checked, and down here, Google Play Intel x86 Atom system image. Don't worry about those Atom_64 images. You'll want them if you're writing native code in modules for C, for example, but we won't be doing that. These are actually 64-bit versions of Android, but they'll run slower even on a 64-bit operating system. This is fairly intuitive. If you untick something, it'll be uninstalled. Once you've been using Android Studio for a while and you've received a number of updates, you may want to remove older versions of some components. To do that, you just untick the box next to the component and then click on the Apply button. We don't want to remove anything at this stage, so make sure you don't untick anything that's already installed. It's not the end of the world if you do. You can just come back in here and install it again. If you've ticked anything that wasn't already installed, click Apply to install it, and I did that, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to click on OK. And the components we download will be downloaded and installed. What we need to do is accept the licensing agreement. So just click on accept for anywhere that there's a little red asterisk, as you can see there. Until you get to the stage that next is available, click on that. And it's going to go ahead now and download and install what we selected on that screen. Just so we can see some of the things that are there while it's actually installing. So looking at those components that we've got the Android SDK platform that we selected. Well, that's basically Android, so we definitely need that. As I said, you only need to install the latest version. The next component that we want to install is the sources for Android 29. That's the source code for Android, and it's very useful when you're using the various components in your code. You can go in and have a look at the code for Android and get ideas on how it all works. If you're installing a version later than API 29, then the sources may not be available straight away. That's fine, just proceed without them and keep checking in the SDK manager every week or so, and eventually they'll be available. Check it, click Apply and install them. So the remaining components that I selected are the system images for the emulators. So an emulator is basically an Android device running on your computer, and you can use them instead of buying loads of Android phones for testing on. We don't need to install all of these though. The first few there are for TVs and Android Wear devices, watches and the like. For me, they're not currently available under Android 10, but note there is options down there for Android TV, Wear devices, etc. under Android 9. So in time they'll appear as well. But we're not covering TV and wearable devices in this course, so there's no need to install those emulators if they appear in your list. What we did is installed those 3 emulators: Intel x86 Atom System Image, Google APIs Intel x86 Atom System Image, and Google Play Intel x86 Atom System Image. We'll talk more about those a bit later. The reason that there's now 3 different system images is that Google have included access to the Google Play Store on the Google Play images. That means you can install apps from the Play Store on the emulator, which is very useful for testing purposes. There is a downside though. The Google Play image restricts access just like a physical Android device. So there are a fair few things that you can't do with the Google Play images. And that's why we also need the Google API image as well. The third image I installed, the plain Intel x86 Atom System image, well, that can be useful to check how your app behaves when something like YouTube can't be installed. And if your app is going to make use of any Google services, you can see what happens when they aren't installed. Alright, so you can see at this point now we're actually finished there. I'm going to click on Finish. Now that's actually finished its job. This time we're now going to go back up and click on SDK Tools. And then we're going to come over here to Show Package Details and check that box as well. Now, quite a lot of the stuff in here is now obsolete, and you certainly won't want to install those without a very good reason. And you can see that the SDK Manager includes an option to hide obsolete packages, and that's ticked by default, which keeps things simpler, and generally would recommend you leave that on. Anything that relates to a preview version, we don't want to install. So as you scroll down, if you see anything that's marked with RC in a number, for example, that stands for Release Candidate. It's not a final version, and you shouldn't in general install it. Most of what we want should already be installed, but there may be updates available, so check the rightmost column to see if any of the components are showing update. You can see for me right now none of them are. If updates are available, make sure they're selected, click Apply to install them before we add anything else. Alright, so in the Android SDK Build Tools section, which was this first section down here, scroll down to the bottom, we want the highest version available. And you can see at the moment that's 29.0.2 as I record this video. But if you've got a later version available and it's not marked as a release candidate, then choose that one instead. In fact, it should already be installed anyway. You can see in this case, we had it installed for us. So scrolling down now, Google have separated the Android emulator from the rest of the platform tools. So we want to make sure, if you scroll down here, that Android emulator is checked. the Android SDK platform tools are checked, and Android SDK tools are checked. And you can see in my case, they are all checked. So make sure they are if you're following along. But there's two here that I do suggest you check. Documentation for Android SDK, check that. And also Google Play services, I suggest you check that as well. Google Play services provides things like Google Maps, so you can include mapping on your apps. So it's a useful thing to install. And the other thing that I suggest you install is the Google USB driver. I'm going to click on that. You'll need that on Windows and probably won't appear on a Linux or Mac computer installation. On Windows though, make sure you check it, otherwise you'll have problems connecting your phone to Android Studio. Now also as we scroll down, you can see down the bottom there, the Intel x86 emulator accelerator Haxum installer should be ticked already if you installed that in the previous video. And if you had problems installing Haxum earlier, then it's worth ticking it here. That way you can run the installer again if you manage to get VTX working on your BIOS, assuming you don't have an AMD CPU, of course. Now, if you enabled the Windows hypervisor platform, you don't need Haxum. In that case, leave it unticked, and that's generally if you followed along and did the steps I outlined in the Windows Android Studio installation video for an AMD CPU. Right, so with everything else selected, click on Apply. We're going to click on OK, and we'll let that go ahead and download and install what it needs to. And if you do get prompted for a license agreement, then go ahead and select that if it's appropriate. In my case, you saw that I didn't get asked for anything, so I haven't checked anything. And just a reminder that you can go back into the SDK manager as often as you want to install new components or delete ones that you've replaced with newer versions. So if you forget to install something, it's really not the end of the world. You can come back here and install it at a later time. Okay, so you can see that's now finished. I'm going to click on Finish. I'm going to click on OK at this point. Alright, so at this point now we're back to the welcome screen and we can end the video. So I'll stop the video here, but in the next one, we'll look at some useful settings that you can make to Android Studio to make it a bit easier to use. See you in the next video.